This is module A4, muscle tissue. The muscle tissue comes in different forms. We've seen all three in the laboratory. Skeletal muscle is the main focus of this module, but towards the end we're going to look at cardiac and smooth muscle as well. Skeletal muscles work in conjunction with the skeletal system to provide directed movement. Our muscles attach to our bones, and as those muscles contract, it causes our bones to move, which then allows us to maintain directed movement. In terms of the muscular system, we will only consider skeletal muscles as they're the only components of the muscular system. Just quickly from lab, what are some of the differences between skeletal muscle and the cardiac and smooth muscles? Well, just to name one difference, the skeletal muscle is voluntary. So we have skeletal muscles versus cardiac and smooth. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. We have conscious control over much of our skeletal muscles, while cardiac and smooth muscles are both involuntary. We do not have conscious control. We do not have to sit there and consciously provide a signal for the beating of our heart or the movement of food through our digestive system. In Objective 1, we're going to look at the functions of muscle tissue. And the book identifies 6 main functions. The first function is to produce skeletal movement. Again, as a muscle is connected to our skeletal system, as that muscle contracts, it allows for the movement of that bone. We use a tremendous amount of musculature within our trunk to maintain body position. Even as you're sitting up in a chair right now, you have dozens of muscles working together to help maintain your posture. Muscles are used to support our soft tissues. If you consider the soft tissues within our abdominal region, our abdominal cavity, we have musculature that helps support and hold those soft tissues in place. Muscle tissue is used to guard openings. If you consider openings of our digestive tract, for instance, we have a mouth at one end and an anus at the other. Both of those openings are regulated by skeletal muscles. Other regions where we use muscle to guard openings, the urethra, the kind of the end point of our urinary system, is also controlled or maintained through the use of skeletal muscle. Muscles are used to help maintain body temperature. As our body temperature drops below normal, skeletal muscles can be used to induce shivering, which through the contraction of those muscles and shivering, we're allowed to heat up. Heat is a byproduct of muscle contraction, and that can be used to help raise our core body temperature back into a homeostatic range. Lastly, muscle tissues can be used to store nutrient reserves. If all other reserves, food reserves, are utilized, our body can break down skeletal muscle and help convert that into energy, into certain types of sugars for use. So it can, in one of the last resorts, be broken down as a nutrient source. In Objective 2, we're going to look at the constituents and the organization of the skeletal muscle. Not only does a skeletal muscle contain muscle tissue, but it also contains a fair amount of connective tissue. We have a relatively rich vasculature, as well as nerve supply. If we look at the organization of that connective tissue, we can find three distinct levels of organization, or three distinct types of connective tissues associated with the organ itself. We'll start out with a structure that is known as the epimysium. And epi refers to on, and mysium refers to muscle. So this literally is a connective tissue that is found on the muscle. I'm going to flip forward so we can look at this diagram. Here we have an actual skeletal muscle, and we find that surrounding the skeletal muscle is the epimysium. So what is the epimysium? Well, this is a connective tissue that helps bind and support the entire muscle. It's largely composed of collagen. It's connected to the deep fascia. I know we haven't discussed fascia much, but that'll come a little bit later. And the epimysium helps to separate the muscle from any of the other internal organs or tissue types. As we move deeper into the organ itself, we can find the perimysium. And again, peri refers to around. Around the muscle. And as we go from the entire, as we look at the entire muscle, here's a cross section of the entire muscle, we find that there are small subdivisions within this muscle. And these structures are known as fascicles. And a fascicle is just a bundle of muscle cells. And these fascicles are covered, several fascicles, many fascicles, are covered by the perimysium. And again, it's this connective tissue that surrounds the bundles of fascicles. And this is where the vasculature and nerve supply enter into the muscle itself. So we have vessels, large blood vessels, as well as nerves come in through the perimysium to supply the fascicles. Lastly, we have the endomysium. And of course, endo refers to inside. So this is inside the muscle. And the endomysium is a connective tissue that will surround the individual muscle cells. The endomysium contains the capillaries. This is the smallest type of blood vessel, as well as the nerve fibers that that come into contact with the muscle cells. And also within the endomysium, we find another type of cell known as the myosatellite cell. We'll talk more about myosatellite cells in a minute, but for now, just realize that these are stem cells and that they help in repairing any type of damage. Let's look at the epimysium. We can find the epimysium right here, and it is going to surround an individual muscle fiber or cell. And here we have the close association between the myosatellite cells and the endomysium. So again, we've looked at the various ways connective tissues are associated with the organ itself, the muscle itself, and there are three major types. There are three major organization of connective tissues. We have the epimysium covering the organ, the skeletal muscle. We have the perimysium covering a muscle fascicle. And then lastly, we have the endomysium covering the muscle fiber. When the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium come together at the ends of a muscle, it forms. They come together and form tendons or aponeuroses, and we'll look at both of these. A tendon is a connective tissue that connects a muscle to a bone. So here's an example of the Achilles tendon. And an aponeurosis is a very broad sheath. So instead of all those connective tissue layers coming together to form a band, an aponeurosis is a very broad sheath. And here off the frontal muscle we find a very broad sheath. So it's the same type of structure. It is connecting a muscle to a bone, but they come in two forms. They can come in a band-like structure known as a tendon, or a very flat sheet-like structure known as an aponeurosis. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, so it's going to need input from the central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. So in order for skeletal muscles to contract, they need to be signaled by the nervous system. Right now, if you are taking notes, there's a signal coming from your central nervous system to the muscles within your arm and your hand that is telling those structures to contract, which then allows you to write and take notes. Skeletal muscle also requires a relatively rich blood supply, and you can imagine that these blood supplies deliver nutrients to those muscle cells. They're going to need a nutrient source in order to metabolize and generate the ATP necessary for muscle contraction. They're going to need a large amount of oxygen. Again, we saw back in Module 2 the importance of oxygen and the aerobic respiration and the generation of ATP. And it's going to need a way to rid itself of waste products. What type of waste products would we expect? Well, we're going to have any of the waste products associated with aerobic metabolism, such as carbon dioxide, but we also have waste product removal related to other types of metabolism that we'll discuss later in this module. And those waste products are associated with anaerobic metabolism without oxygen. But again, we'll talk more about that later. So this is why such an extensive vascular system is needed. Lots of energy is required for muscle contraction. In order for the body to maintain that level of energy needed, it's going to require nutrients and oxygen for aerobic respiration. In Objective 3, we're going to look at muscles at the cellular level. We're going to look at the development of a muscle fiber. Students often get confused. to this point, we've been looking at cells as being these small units with a single nuclei. And something very different happens or occurs in the development of a muscle. We start off with a cell known as the myoblast, and you should recognize the term blast as referring to a cell that is immature. An immature muscle cell. We saw blast when we were looking at the osteoblasts, and if you remember, the osteoblasts were immature bone cells that eventually differentiated into osteocytes. So we have these immature muscle cells that start to fuse, and as they fuse, these muscle cells create this very large, this very long muscle fiber that eventually contains hundreds of nuclei. Let's look at a diagram that looks, this is figure 10.2. And again, we start out up here with these myoblasts, these individual immature muscle cells. And these myoblasts begin to fuse. Here we see the fusion of two cells, two myoblasts. And as they fuse, they start to develop a structure that is called a muscle fiber. And in all intent and purposes, we can consider this muscle fiber just the mature muscle cell. They're just a slightly different from a regular cell in that they contain multiple nuclei. Not all of the myoblasts fuse. There's always a few that are left unfused, and these are the myosatellite cells. These are still myoblasts. And myoblasts are always present. If you remember, they kind of hang out in the epimysium. And these myoblasts are there in case any type of repair is needed. These myoblasts can easily differentiate and fuse into a damaged muscle fiber and help with any type of repair issues. So again, we have these myoblasts. They start fusing into a muscle fiber, and eventually what you end up with is this very large, mature muscle fiber that is multinucleated. There are hundreds of nuclei. So hundreds of myoblasts fuse together to form a mature muscle fiber. And this is where contraction occurs, and this is something we'll look at a little bit later. But again, we need to note that these mature muscle fibers can be tremendously long. They can be inches long. If you consider some of the very long muscles in the thigh, these muscle fibers can run the length from tendon to tendon. So they can be upwards of 12 inches long.